Chapter 11, I'll Fly Away. It was the third bomb threat in 2 months. As we quickly cleared the office and waited for the police to arrive, the entire EJI staff, five attorneys, an investigator, law school interns, and three administrative staff members were nervous. None of them had signed on for bomb threats. It was tempting to ignore them, but 2 years earlier, an African civil rights lawyer in Savannah, Georgia, named Robert Robbie Robinson, was murdered when a bomb sent to his law office exploded. Around the same time, a federal appeals court judge, Robert Vance, was killed in Birmingham by a mail bomb. Days later, a third bomb was sent to a civil rights office in Florida and a fourth to a courthouse in Atlanta. The bomber seemed to be attacking legal professionals connected to civil rights. We were warned that we could be targets, and for weeks we carefully hauled our mail packages to the federal courthouse for x-ray screenings before opening them. After that, bomb threats were no joke. Everyone fled the building while we discussed the likelihood of an actual bombing. The caller had described our building precisely when making his threat. Sharon, our receptionist, said the man had sounded middle-aged and Southern, but she couldn't give any more description. It wasn't his first time calling. "I'm doing you a favor," he said threateningly. "I want y'all to stop doing what you're doing. My first option is not to kill everybody, so you better get out of there now. Next time there will be a warning." Although I was handling other cases, I was certain the calls were in response to the McMillan case. Michael and I had been followed several times while doing investigative work in Monroe County. I got threatening calls at home. One typical caller said, "If you think we're going to let you help that low life get away with killing that girl, you've got another thing coming. You're both going to be dead." It was hard to know how seriously to take any of it, but it was definitely unnerving. After we cleared the building, the police went through the office with dogs. No bomb was found, and when the building didn't blow up after an hour and a half, we all filed back inside. We had work to do. By the fax machine. When only 3 sheets of paper came through the machine, I was concerned. The pages contained a tersely worded order from Judge Norton denying us relief. After all that, Walter's death penalty conviction remained. I had suspected that this would be Judge Norton's response. For all his interest at the hearing, he had never seemed particularly interested in the basic question of whether Walter was guilty or. What was surprising, however, was how superficial and thoughtless the court's 2.5-page order read. The judge addressed only Ralph Meyer's testimony and none of the many legal claims we'd presented or any of the testimonies of the other dozen-plus witnesses. I was disappointed but not hopeless. There was a next step. We could bring our evidence to the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals. We were now regularly arguing cases in front of the court, and they were starting to respond to our advocacy. We had won 4 reversals in death penalty cases in 1994, more in 1991, and by the end of 1992, we'd won relief for another 8 death row prisoners. Though the court was often resistant, we persisted and continued raising serious errors in capital cases. I was optimistic that we could win relief for Mr. McMillan on appeal, even if the court was unwilling to rule that Walter was innocent and should be released. The withholding of exculpatory evidence in his favor was extreme enough that the case would likely require a new trial. I explained to Walter that the Alabama Court of Criminal Appeals, we were only just now getting to a court where our claims would be seriously considered. At the time, Michael had been hired as a San Diego federal public defender. He agonized about leaving EJI, but he was ready to leave Alabama. One of our new attorneys, Bernard Harcourt replaced him on Walter's case. Bernard was a lot like Michael in that he was smart, determined, and extremely hardworking. He had been preparing for a traditional legal career until he came down to work with us one summer and became fascinated by the issues that death penalty cases presented. He quickly immersed himself in Walter's case. The crowd at Walter's hearing got the community talking about what we had presented in court. More people started coming forward with helpful information and claims of police corruption and misconduct. Bernard and I continued to track leads and interview people in Monroe County. Not everyone was swayed by the hearing, though. Local Monroeville and mobile newspapers printed claims that Walter was a drug kingpin, a sexual predator, and a gang leader. Despite all the evidence presented at our hearing showing that Walter had nothing to do with the Pittman murder, the local press used it to scare up more fear about him. The narrative in the press was clear. This man was extremely dangerous. The threats we received made me worry about the hostility that Walter would face if he ever was released. I wondered how safely he could live locally if everyone outside his community was persuaded that he was a dangerous murderer. The case was now pending in the Court of Criminal Appeals. If the public could only know what we knew, it might ease his re-entry into freedom. We wanted people to understand this simple fact. Walter did not commit that murder. Could some positive media attention help our case? I wasn't so sure. In fact, the chief judge on the court, John Patterson, had famously sued the New York Times over their coverage of the civil rights movement when he was Alabama's governor. It was a common tactic used by Southern politicians during civil rights protests. Accuse newspapers of trying to ruin their reputations, even sue them for defamation if they provided sympathetic coverage of civil rights activists, or if they critiqued Southern politicians and law enforcement officers. I had no doubt that national press coverage of Walter's case would not help our cause at the Court of Criminal Appeals. My general attitude was that press coverage rarely helped our clients. Beyond the general anti-media sentiments in the South, the death penalty was a politically charged topic. Even sympathetic pieces about people on death row usually triggered a backlash that created more problems for the client and the case. But I did think getting more informed view of Walter's conviction in the murder would convince some locals that he was innocent, and assuming we could ever get his conviction overturned, make his life after release less dangerous. It was risky, but we felt that we had to take our chances and get the story out. Journalist Pete Early jumped into the case, spent time with several of the involved individuals, and quickly came to share our astonishment that Walter had been convicted on such unreliable evidence. That year, I'd given a speech at Yale Law School that was attended by a producer from the popular CBS investigative program 60 Minutes, and he also called me. We filed our appeal in the Court of Criminal Appeals that summer, and with no small amount of lingering uncertainty, I decided to move forward with the 60 Minutes piece. Veteran reporter Ed Bradley and his producer David Gelber came down from New York City to Monroeville on a 100-degree day in July and interviewed many of the people whose testimony we'd presented at our hearing. They spoke with Walter, Ralph Myers, Karen Kelly, Darnell Houston, Clay Cast, Jimmy Williams, Walter's family, and Woodrow Eichner. They confronted Bill Hooks at his job and interviewed Tommy Chapman extensively. When the 60 Minutes piece aired months later, local officials and local media outlets were quick to discredit it, claiming that it was further injuring Rhonda Morrison's parents. Writers at local newspapers complained that the new publicity could lead many people to think McMillan is innocent. But people in the community watched 60 Minutes all the time and generally trusted it. Despite the local media reaction, the CBS coverage gave the community a summary of the evidence we'd presented in court and created questions and doubts about Walter's guilt. People in the Black community who had been discussing Walter's wrongful conviction for years were thrilled to see honest coverage of the case. We frequently got calls from people simply seeking an update or a clarification of a particular point that had been the subject of debate in a barbershop or at a social gathering. For many Black people in the region, watching the evidence that we presented in court now laid out on national television was therapeutic. It turned out that privately, District Attorney Tom Chapman had started worrying about the reliability of the evidence against Walter. Given our success in other death penalty cases, he must have feared that the court might indeed overturn Walter's conviction. Chapman had become the public face defending the conviction, and he realized that he put his own integrity on the line by relying on the work of local investigators, work that was now revealed as almost laughably flawed. Chapman called together Tate, Larry Eichner, and Vinson shortly after the hearing to ask them to explain the contradictory evidence we had presented. He wasn't impressed with what he heard. Finally, he decided to ask ABI officials in Montgomery to re-examine the evidence and conduct another investigation into the murder to confirm Mr. McMillan's guilt, something we'd been asking him to do for more than 2 years. Chapman never told us directly that he was starting another investigation. We found out about it when the new investigators from the ABI, Tom Taylor and Greg Cole, called me. After meeting with them, I was more hopeful about what might come out of the investigation. They were not connected to any of the players in South Alabama. They both seemed no nonsense, experienced, and interested in doing honest and reliable work. We gave them all our case files and evidence. We had nothing to hide. I was confident that any reasonable, honest investigation would reveal the absurdity of the charges against Walter. By January, 6 months had passed since we had filed our appeal at the Court of Criminal Appeals, and a ruling was due any week. That's when Tom Taylor called us and said that he and Cole wanted to meet with us again. We'd talked a few times during their investigation, but this time we'd finally be discussing their findings. When they arrived, Bernard and I sat down with them in my office, and they wasted no time. There is no way Walter McMillan killed Rhonda Morrison. Tom Taylor spoke plainly and directly. We're going to report to the Attorney General, the District Attorney, and anyone who asks that McMillan had nothing to do with either of these murders and is completely innocent. I tried not to look as thrilled as I felt. I didn't want to scare anyone away. I did not want to scare away this good news. That's terrific, I said, trying to sound unsurprised. I'm pleased to hear that, and I have to say I'm extremely grateful that you've looked at the evidence in this case thoroughly and honestly. Well, confirming that McMillan had nothing to do with this wasn't that hard, Taylor replied. What we were told by local law enforcement about McMillan didn't make much sense, and the story Myers told at trial definitely made no sense. I still can't believe a jury ever convicted him. Cole spoke up. You'll be very interested to know that both Hooks and Hightower have admitted that their trial testimony was false. Really? I couldn't hide my surprise at this. Yes. When we were asked to investigate this case, we were told that you should be investigated because Hooks had said that you had offered him money in a condo in Mexico if he changed his testimony. Taylor was dead serious. A condo in Mexico? On a beach, I think, Cole added nonchalantly. Wait, me? I was going to give Bill Hooks a beach condo in Mexico if he changed his testimony against Walter? It was difficult to contain my shock. Well, I know it must sound crazy to you, but believe me, there were people down there who were raring to get you indicted. But when we talked to Hooks, it didn't take very long before he not only acknowledged that he'd never spoken to you and that you had never bribed him, but he also admitted that his trial testimony against McMillan was completely made up. We've never had any doubts that Hooks was lying, I noted. Cole chuckled. We started polygraphing people and things fell apart pretty quickly. Bernard asked the obvious question, what happens now? Taylor looked over at his partner and then at us. Well, we're not completely done. We'd like to solve this crime. I'm wondering if you might be willing to help us. I know you're not trying to get anybody on death row, but we thought you might consider providing some help to identify the real killer. People will be a lot more accepting of Mr. McMillan's innocence if they know who really committed this crime. Well, while it was ridiculous to think that Walter's freedom depended on someone else's arrest, we had long ago concluded that finding the real murderer might be the most effective way to free him. Without law enforcement officers on our side, though, we were limited in what we could uncover. Here's what we had so far. Several witnesses had told us that around the time of the crime, they'd seen a white man leaving the cleaners. We had learned that before her death, Rhonda Morrison had been receiving menacing calls and that there was a man who had been inappropriately pursuing her, stopping by unannounced at the cleaners, maybe even stalking her. We had not been able to identify this strange man, but we did have our suspicions. A white man who seemed intensely interested in the case contacted us frequently to ask about the investigation. He would hint at having information that could help and repeatedly told us he would help prove that Walter McMillan was innocent. He even claimed to know where the murder weapon, which had never been recovered, might be located. We researched the caller's background and discovered a history of stalking, violence against women, and preoccupation with the Morrison murder. We began to think that our caller could be the person who had murdered Rhonda Morrison. We had dozens of phone conversations with him and even met him a couple of times. Once we asked him direct questions about where he was on the day of the murder, which must have alarmed him because we heard from him less often after that. Before I could tell any of this to the ABI investigators, Taylor named our suspect. I told Taylor to give us a few days to organize the information and recordings of the phone calls, and then we would turn it over. We want to get Walter out of prison as soon as possible, I insisted. Well, I think the Attorney General and the lawyers would like to maintain the status quo for a few more months until we can make an arrest of the actual killer. Right, but do you understand that the status quo is a problem for us? Walter has been on death row for nearly 6 years for a crime he didn't commit. Taylor and Cole looked at each other uncomfortably. Taylor admitted, if I was in prison for something I didn't do and you were my lawyer, I hope you'd get me out as soon as you could. When they left, Bernard and I were very excited, but we remained troubled by this plan to maintain the status quo. I was furious that the state would try to prolong any order granting relief to Walter. It was consistent with everything that had happened over the last 6 years, but it was still maddening. We told the court that there was overwhelming evidence that Mr. McMillan's rights had been violated and that he was entitled to immediate relief. Delaying relief would add further injury to a man who had been wrongfully convicted and condemned to death row for a crime he did not commit. I was talking to Minnie and the family every week now, keeping everyone updated about the new state investigation. I feel like something good is about to happen, Brian, Minnie said to me. They've kept him for years. Now it's time they let him go. They have to let him go. I appreciated their optimism, but I was worried too. We'd been disappointed so often before. Managing the family's expectations was a complex task. I felt I was supposed to be the cautionary voice that prepared family members for the worst, even while I urged them to hope for the best. Increasingly, I was recognizing the importance of hopefulness in creating justice. On February 23rd, nearly 6 weeks after getting the ABI's report, I received a call from the clerk of the court. The Court of Criminal Appeals had ruled in the McMillan case and we could pick up the opinion. You're going to like this, she said mysteriously. I ran to the courthouse. By the time I sat down to read the 35-page ruling, I was out of breath. The clerk was right. The ruling invalidated Walter's conviction and death sentence. The court didn't conclude that he was innocent and must be released, but it ruled in our favor on every other claim and ordered a new trial. I didn't realize how much I had feared that we would lose until we finally won. I jumped into the car and raced down to death row to tell Walter in person. I watched him take it all in. He leaned back and gave me a familiar chuckle. Well, he said slowly, you know, that's good. That's good. Good? It's great. Yes, it is great. He was grinning now with a freedom I hadn't seen before. Whew, man, I can't believe it. I can't believe it. Whew. His smile started to fade and he began slowly shaking his head. 6 years gone. He looked away with a pained expression. These 6 years feel like 50. 6 years just gone. I've been so worried they were going to kill me. I haven't even thought about the time I've lost. His troubled look sobered me too. I know, Walter, and we're not clear yet, I said. The ruling only gives you a new trial. Given what the ABI has said, I can't believe they would try to prosecute you again, but with this crowd, reasonable conduct is never guaranteed. I'm going to try and get you home as soon as humanly possible. With thoughts of home, his mood lightened and we started talking about things we'd been too afraid to discuss since we'd met. He said, I want to meet everybody who has helped me in Montgomery, and I want to go around with you and tell the world what they did to me. There are other people here who are as innocent as I am. He paused and started smiling again. Man, I want some good food too. I ain't had no real good food in so long, I can't even remember what it tastes like. Whatever you want, it will be my treat, I said proudly. From what I hear, you might not be able to afford the kind of meal I want, he teased. I want steak, chicken, pork, maybe some good cooked coon. We relaxed and laughed a lot. We laughed before that. Walter's sense of humor hadn't failed him despite his 6 years on death row. But the laughter that day felt very different. It was the laughter of liberation. I drove back to Montgomery and thought about how to speed up Walter's release. I called Tommy Chapman and told him that I intended to file a motion to dismiss all charges against Walter in light of the appellate court ruling. I asked if he would consider joining the motion or at least not opposing it. He sighed. I'll get back to you about whether I'll join it. We certainly won't oppose it. The state did, in fact, join our motion to dismiss the charges. A final hearing on the motion was set, and it wouldn't last more than a few minutes. Walter would finally be able to walk out of the courthouse a free man. The night before the hearing, I drove down to Minnie's to get a suit for Walter. Couldn't come back here. It's just all been too much. The stress, the gossip, the lies, everything. He doesn't deserve what they put him through, and it will hurt me to my heart the rest of my life what they did to him and the rest of us. I don't think I can go back to the way things were. Well, you should, you all should talk when he gets home. We want to have everybody over when he gets out. We want to cook some good food and everybody will want to celebrate. But after that, maybe we should go to Montgomery with you, she said. I had already talked with Walter about not staying his first few nights in Monroeville for security reasons. We had talked about him spending time with family members in Florida while we monitored the local reaction to his release, but I hadn't discussed his future with Minnie. I drove back to Montgomery, sadly realizing that even as we stood on the brink of victory and what should have been glorious release for Walter and his family, this whole nightmare, the conviction, the death sentence, the heartbreak and devastation of this miscarriage of justice would likely never be completely over for him. State, local, and national media outlets were crowded outside the courthouse when I arrived the next morning. Dozens of Walter's family members and friends from the community were there to greet him when he came out. They had made signs, banners, which surprised me. They were such simple gestures, but I found myself deeply moved. The signs have a silent voice to the crowd. Welcome home, Johnny D. God never fails. Free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last. I went down to the jail and brought Walter his suit. I told him that a celebration was planned at his house after the hearing. The prison had not allowed Walter to bring his possessions to the courthouse, refusing to acknowledge that he might be released. So we would have to go back to Holman prison to get his things before the homecoming meal. I also told him that I'd reserved a hotel room for him in Montgomery and that it would probably be safest to spend the next few nights there. I reluctantly talked to him about my conversation with Minnie. He seemed surprised and hurt, but didn't linger on it. This is a really happy day for me. Nothing can really spoil getting your freedom back. Well, you all should talk at some point, I urged. I went upstairs to find Tommy Chapman waiting for me in the courtroom. After we're done, I'd like to shake his hand, he told me. Would that be all right? I think he'd appreciate that, I said. The case has taught me things I didn't even know I had to learn, Chapman said. We've all learned a lot, Tommy. Everyone was strangely pleasant. Judge Norton had retired weeks before the ruling, and the new judge, Pamela Baschub, greeted me warmly. Mr. Stevenson, I don't need any arguments or statements. I intend to grant the motion immediately so you all can get home. We can get this done quickly, she said. There was no metal detector, no menacing dog. The courtroom was packed with Walter's family members and supporters. There were more cheering Black folks outside the courthouse who couldn't get in. A horde of television cameras and journalists spilled out of the crowded courtroom. They finally brought Walter into the courtroom wearing the black suit and white shirt I'd brought him. The deputies didn't handcuff Walter or shackle him, so he walked in waving to family and friends. Many in the crowd gasped. His family had not seen him dressed in anything but his white prison uniform in 6 years. He looked handsome and fit, like a different man. The judge took the bench and I stepped forward to speak. I gave a brief history of the case and informed the court that both the defendant and the state were moving the court to dismiss all charges. The judge quickly granted the motion and asked if there was anything further. Everyone was suddenly generous and accommodating. It was as if they wanted to be sure there were no hard feelings or grudges. I felt strangely agitated. We were about to leave court for the last time, and I started thinking about how much pain and suffering had been inflicted on Walter, his family, the entire community. I thought about how if Judge Robert E. Lee Key Jr. hadn't overridden the jury's verdict of life imprisonment without parole and imposed the death penalty, which is what brought the case to our attention, Walter likely could have spent the rest of his life incarcerated and died in a prison cell. I thought about how certain it was that hundreds, maybe thousands of other people were just as innocent as Walter, but would never get the help they need. I knew this wasn't the time to make a speech, but I couldn't stop myself from making one final comment. Your Honor, I spoke up. I just want to say this before we adjourn. It was far too easy to convict this wrongly accused man for murder and send him to death row for something he didn't do, and much too hard to win his freedom after proving his innocence. We have serious problems and important work that must be done in this state. I sat down and the judge pronounced Walter free to go. Just like that, he was a free man. Walter hugged me tightly and I gave him a handkerchief to wipe the tears from his eyes. Graciously, Walter agreed to shake Chapman's hand. I asked Bernard to tell the family and supporters that we would meet them out front. Walter stood very close to me as we answered questions from the press. I could tell he was feeling overwhelmed, so I cut off the questions after a few minutes. TV camera crews followed us as we exited the courthouse. Outside, dozens of people cheered and waved their signs. Walter's relatives ran up to hug him, and they hugged me too. Walter's grandchildren grabbed his hands. Walter couldn't believe how many people were there for him. Even when some of the men came up to shake his hand, he gave them a hug. I told everyone that Bernard and I had to take Walter to the prison to pick up his things and that we would come to the house directly from there. On the drive to the prison, Walter told me that the men on death row had held a special service for him on his last night. They had come to pray for him and give him their final hugs. Walter said he felt guilty leaving them behind. I told him not to. They were all thrilled to know he was going home. His freedom was, in a small way, a sign of hope in a hopeless place. We went to the prison office to collect Walter's possessions, his legal materials and correspondence with me, letters from family and supporters, a Bible, the Timex watch he was wearing when he was arrested, and the wallet he had with him back in June 1987 when his nightmare began. The wallet still had $23 in it. Walter had given to other death row prisoners his fan, a dictionary, and the food items he had in his cell. A few guards watched as we walked out the front gate of the prison. Members of the press and people from Walter's family and community had followed our car to the prison. Lots of people were gathered outside. I saw Miss Williams. Walter went up to her and gave her a hug. She looked over and winked at me. I couldn't help but laugh. Men in their cells could see the crowd outside and started shouting encouragement to Walter as we walked away. We couldn't see them from outside the prison, but their voices rang out just the same. The voices were haunting because they were disembodied, but they were full of excitement and hopefulness. One of the last voices we heard was a man shouting, "Stay strong, man, stay strong." Walter shouted back, "All right." As he walked to the car, Walter raised his arms and gently moved them up and down as if he meant to take flight. He looked at me and said, "I feel like a bird. I feel like a bird."